Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Onboarding from Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365 webinar. Just a few webinar housekeeping items. This will be an hour-long webinar. There is a Q&A or questions option here in the webinar, so please use that. If any questions come up during the webinar, we'll try to continue to remind you to use that. And then also note that you won't be able to turn on your video or microphone during this. So just make sure if you do have those questions that you do use that questions section. So your webinar panelists today are going to be myself, Jason Trier. I'm a senior customer onboarding engineer. We also have Tyson Fewens, who's a customer onboarding architect. We are with the customer success department or part of the organization of Veeam here, and our main purpose is to work with mid-market enterprise customers on their net new purchase and implementation, ensuring that they get a great foundation and best practices for success of the deployment of the product. I want to go ahead and dive right into the Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365 components. On the upper left-hand side here, you can see the Microsoft 365 Cloud or tenant. The four major products that we go ahead and protect are going to be Exchange Online, OneDrive for Business, SharePoint Online, and Microsoft Teams. A little bit further down in the green box, we've got the Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365 management server. This is a Windows box. This can be installed on a virtual machine, a physical box, as well as in the cloud, maybe Amazon EC2 or Azure VM instance. We also have backup as a service for Microsoft 365 as well. This is called Veeam Data Cloud, and we'll actually get to this a little bit later in the webinar and go over that. In the lower left-hand corner, you'll see Exchange and SharePoint. We also do protect on-prem those products on-prem as well with the product. Now, on the right-hand side, you're going to see a proxy server, the management 365 server, as well as backup storage. So these are going to be the three main components to Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365. Starting with the proxy server, this is going to go ahead and be the main. This is going to go ahead and be the main component for sourcing data. We're going to be authenticating to the Microsoft 365 tenant or on-prem. And this is where we're going to be doing our data transfer, encryption, transformation of that data into backup chains, as well as the management server here in the middle. So the two things we want to point out is we have PostgreSQL databases. That's the cache database and the configuration database, as well as NATS Jetstream engine, which Tyson will cover a little bit later on here in the webinar as well. So backup storage, we can go to local storage, we can go to object storage. We typically recommend that you go to object storage or use object storage with this product. It plays nice with the type of data that we're protecting. You can also do a backup copy of your data, but this is only with object storage. So this has to be primary storage or primary backup of object into object storage, and then backup copy into object storage as well. So you could go through, you go to Azure Blob to say AWS S3 Glacier if you're looking to maybe get some different retention or have a backup copy of that data. The final piece here is going to be the self-restore portal. If you're familiar with Veeam Backup and replication, we have Veeam Explorers, and these are going to be the way that we installed on the management server. We can get access to those products for the restoration of files for those products. And the self-restore portal for 365 is actually just an extension of that. We also have Veeam Explorers on 365 as well, but the restore portal is going to be more specific to giving other individuals access. Maybe you want to give individual users access to restore their data, or you want to give managers access to restore individuals' data. And this is going to basically help your help desk or system administrators, is going to alleviate them to not getting so many restore requests. So looking at product architecture, I mentioned this a little bit, but I think it's important to really specify that we are using PostgreSQL for that configuration database. So all of the backup jobs, the repositories, the configuration that we're putting in to that Veeam console is going to be stored here. We also have Postgres for the cache database. Now, with our backups with object storage, we're going to be taking metadata of the data that we're protecting. Now, this is going to be stored in the cache database. It also isn't stored in the object storage itself, but it's important to have it local to the box, and this is going to alleviate API calls, API costs that we might be doing for backing up a data, looking at where that data is, or restoration of that data. So we can do those calls locally. I just want to point out and note here, the local cache sizing is 1% of the overall protected data that you're protecting with this product. When we look at access control, so the access control for the Veeam console is going to be support for both users and group accounts. Doesn't require local system administrator privileges for this access. Within the console itself, we can define a Veeam Backup administrator role, and we can assign those to those users and or groups. Now, MFA login, as far as security, this is going to be one thing that we can utilize as well for those specific accounts. And note that this does work for both the console and Veeam Explorers. Immutable backups. This is one of the, obviously more important things in the industry today. It's the most important thing for your organization, ensuring that we can set flags on that data. That data is not going to be potentially compromised by a malicious actor. So we have that support for object storage. Now it's going to use native object lock capabilities for that. And you're going to be able to set that immutability period in days. A pretty standard recommendation here in the industry is that you're going to want to set that immutability period less than the overall retention period. Just noting that, hey, we don't want immutability to trump essentially your retention period that you have set. Now, by default, it's compliance mode. We do have support for governance mode as well, and this is storage dependent. And then again, retention period, making sure that you have that set up properly. It actually can be increased after the initial configuration, as I mentioned there. For the immutability options that we have, again, for that governance mode is optional. Primary backup is supported, backup copy also supported. The difference there is going to be compliance mode is strictly compliant to whatever retention that you're setting, and governance mode is going to give you that capability to go in and as a specific account and modify that data, right? Immutability period equal retention period or less than, that's absolutely supported. Extending the retention period is supported on primary backup, not on the backup copy. So you just want to make note of that. Immutability period is less than the day set, and then extending a mutability period is supported on primary backup. So when we take a look at a simple deployment, an all-in-one, what we call an all-in-one deployment for Veeam Backup for 365, we want to say this is going to be roughly right around 1,000 users. On the left-hand side, we're looking at those four products from Microsoft 365. In this header, we're looking at that VB 365, Veeam Backup for 365 backup server. And this is going to be the proxy role. It's going to have all the roles initially installed on it, the backup, potentially, the repository, maybe it's utilizing object storage in the cloud, but it's also going to have those databases, that cache and configuration database. We take a look at job design. So job design is one of the more important things with the product. And one of the things that I want to point out right away here is that if you're familiar with Veeam Backup and replication, when you're creating a job, you're setting your retention on the job. That is not the way that we do that with Veeam Backup for 365. The retention is actually going to be set at the repository level. So if you've got different retentions for different services, you're going to want to go ahead and maybe create different repositories for those services, or maybe the subset of data. If you've got certain data that needs to be protected longer with a specific service, that's going to be one use case. Failure domain, it's best practice that even at a minimum, we split it out into 4 different jobs. protecting each individual service with those jobs. They could all go to the same object, repository. They could go to separate repositories. Maybe one benefit of having separate repositories is if you're doing maybe some data analytics and reporting of what that overall space that's being used on that repository. You could, you know, indicate, hey, mail's using this amount of storage, and OneDrive's using this amount of storage. So that's maybe some, I think, from the field, some things that you may want to consider when you're doing this configuration for your organization. Also, the other thing that I want to point out here is when you create those jobs, if they're separate, you can run this concurrency thing. It's related to concurrency, so you can run them at a different time. You could set, your mail job to run earlier in the day, and then, subsequently run your OneDrive job. That way, you're, maybe having some alleviation on your compute and your system and your backups, your backup storage, things like that. So that's another thing to consider. Another great tool that we have here at Veeam is going to be our calculator. You can see this calculator. We have a link for it here. We'll make sure that you guys have this link here as well in the webinar. This you're going to see. So if we open up this web page here, we would actually be looking at the data center. So if you look at that image, you're going to see the data center right in the center there. But if we look at software as a service, so you click on that, you're going to see your 365 tab. We're going to be able to go through here and delineate all of the mailboxes and objects that that we're backing up, the source amount of data, change rates, or retention. And you're going to be able to do this for all of those 4 products and get an output. It's going to tell you your compute sizing recommendations. What should your management server be? What compute? How many cores? How much memory should you get there? For the management server, for your proxy servers, it's also going to tell you how much data, repository space you're going to need over the life of your backups. So this is going to be a great tool that you're going to want to make sure that you use, especially if you're, just getting into the product and you're doing the sizing and just getting built out for the first time. Now, I do want to go ahead and hand it over to Tyson, who's going to he's going to actually expand this product a little bit more. We've really gone over core product architecture, looking at all-in-one kind of simple, what I call simple deployment. He's going to look at what's going to be more distributed deployment, more of these advanced features as you scale out the environment, as you're looking for that additional performance, and maybe some security aspects there as well. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to him, and he can go ahead and jump into that with you guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. So to kind of kick it off, there's an additional piece that Jason mentioned early on in one of the first slides about this concept of NAT server running as part of the management layer. So this can be deployed by default. It's deployed on the VB365 server. This was a newer process that Veeam added to the 365 backup. What it does is it gives us the ability to use a messaging queue to kind of scale out the proxy workload. So one of the kind of functions that we get from this is this ability with Jetstream to have this replay data. So this gives us kind of that high availability function, so that if we can actually potentially scale out horizontally and have multiple proxies backing up to kind of grow the performance depending on the size and quantity of the objects and data that we're backing up. Kind of how this works in the background, you see here that there's several queues that we're using to kind of track through. So, all the job changes, control, it's got session event, orchestration. All of this is basically the proxies can act as consumers of these queues, which gives us just that, like I said, that high availability spread, so that we can actually do some pretty cool things. And Jason, I'll ask you to go to the next slide here. Because part of what this opens up is this new concept of proxy pools. What proxy pools does is, instead of having a proxy that's directly tied to a repository and where we're kind of locally caching all of that data within a proxy, we can now kind of decouple all of those processes because of this distributed model using messaging queues. And so now proxy pools is where we can actually pool, kind of similar to our VBR product, where we can have several proxies and we can just kind of let that auto load balance. We can set that up within the product. So within the proxy pools, it gives us that big scalability. It gives us easier management because, as I'll demo here soon, it gives us the ability to take proxies offline for to do basic tasks, updates and all that kind of stuff. We can put them in a maintenance mode and handle that. It also gives us the ability to scale for both backups and restores. So not just speeding up performance of backup, but also where we need additional load to pull data back for restores. This is the one caveat here, and that's kind of where Jason had mentioned, like we do highly recommend object storage, is the way proxy pools work right now. They're designed to work only with object storage repositories. So if you're using local disk-based storage that is not presented as object, then we'll be confined to using one proxy for that repository. But in the case that you are using the object, we'll be able to do these proxy pools. And part of that too is that we've introduced Linux proxies as a possibility. So now we can have a mix of Windows and Linux proxies. We can actually pool these together as well. And so that we can kind of scale out, and you can even scale these across different infrastructures and stuff too. The proxy on Linux is, again, that's tied directly to object storage. Another benefit of using object storage as your primary repository is this ability to kind of do some lightweight Linux. Says here that RHEL and Ubuntu are supported, as you'll see in the lab. I have some Linux proxies that I'll show you in a little bit that are running Ubuntu. So together, this proxy pool and the NATS queue that I mentioned, like, gives us that ability to have multiple proxies that can load balance the workload across a job. So as we have, say, a large SharePoint deployment, or a lot of users that we're backing up mailboxes, instead of queuing up on one proxy or potentially vertically scaling a proxy to a massive size, we can scale out and just add multiple proxies to this pool. By default, like, we'll load balance. So like it says here, 64 objects per proxy processor. So each CPU or virtual CPU on the proxy will be able to hand that many threads. And so we can scale out that horizontally just to match the load that we're trying to push through. It automatically, like it says, it'll do some resource checks to kind of keep them in balance, and I'll show you that kind of how it scans and updates within the console, kind of where those proxies are sitting on current resource usage. And because of this queuing system, we can kind of automatically load balance across the proxies that are consuming the messages that the queue is putting. A newer feature too is that we will automatically do some throttling based balancing. So if we potentially run into Microsoft's throttling, I'll say not really potentially, that's generally we're going to hit Microsoft's throttling at some point. We will automatically receive those like back off messages, the 429 errors, and it's built into the product that the proxies will slow down. So if it's saying that we need to wait to the next 5-minute mark for to continue with our pull requests of the data, then we'll automatically back off. So it's going to check for those every 10 minutes. And it's going to let us kind of control the flow and better handle Microsoft throttling. Again, this is so the job objects, and part of that NATS queue is that we're going to be able to spread this across. So if we have, say, one large job with 1,000 or 2,000 objects in it or more, we can, instead of dumping that all to one proxy and just letting it queue up and run over time, we can actually spread this out so that we get more parallel performance. This does So there is some processing priorities. So obviously, if we're doing restore of data, we're going to let that take precedence. And then incremental and full backup. So it kind of gives you that idea that if we're running a long full backup on one service, so say we have a real large SharePoint that's taking a lot of time, we're still going to prioritize incremental backups because potentially, say your mail job kicks off. We want to give that precedence so it completes and it doesn't queue up behind that long running full. So that logic is built into the product to kind of handle those priorities. Rebalancing. So this is the kind of that replay that we were talking about with the messaging queue. It gives us kind of that ability for that high availability function. So if we have a proxy pool, say for example with like 3 proxies, and for some reason one of them goes offline during a job, we can automatically replay those messages to the other proxies and rebalance for any messages that weren't that didn't show complete. Basically, like the proxy will handle a message and update back to the queue. So if one goes offline and there's outstanding objects that have not been backed up, we can redistribute across the proxy pool. There's some other functions in here. It's just talking about how the queue is handled and how it provides high availability. Part of that I'll talk about later is how we can potentially distribute this even further to kind of give it like distributing the databases and the NAT server. But as it kind of says the function as new jobs come in. You can move on, Jason. Thank you. Also, we can do custom service accounts for proxies. So when we add a new proxy to VB365, we can either have a pre-existing account that we can use and we can connect to, or we can specify like a pre-existing account as a custom account for the service, or we can use local system. This is supported for both. So when you connect a Linux server, you can also say, I want to use like a built-in function. So it can use like a Veeam Backup for 365 user by default that it'll create. Or you can use a service account that you've already created. And you can move on from there. So kind of this idea is we're taken from that initial all-in-one deployment that Jason discussed, is now we get this more kind of as we're growing and we have a bigger footprint of data, we can take and kind of scale up to meet a different performance requirement. And that's adding kind of what I was saying about this proxy pool concept, to where now instead of having like the backup server acting as that all-in-one, proxying the data, doing all those different components, we can separate this out. We can have dedicated proxies that scale horizontally. It gives us that load balancing. So say if proxy 2 needs an update, I can take that down with maintenance mode. Jobs will continue to run on the other proxies, and then I can always bring it back when it's ready. So it gives us the ability to kind of work through maintenance schedules or to handle different downtime, because we can spread these proxies across different failure domains. And from there, we are going to jump into a demo. So I'm going to kind of take a lot of the things that we've discussed here and just give you a little insight into how this looks within the product. All right, so you should be seeing we're inside of a lab environment that I have set up here. And the first thing I'm going to do is connect to Veeam Backup for 365. This is deployed on a separate server, not the one that I'm on. So we'll see that I'm running the console remotely. I can connect to that other server. I'm going to give it my password here. And you'll see right away that we talked about MFA. When you first set this up, this is it's the basic like OTP style. Like you'll get a QR code that you scan with your authentication app that will give you then that rotating password. And I've got it pulled up on my phone here. All right, so we see that we're connected into the VB365 console. I do want to point out this pops up because of a current setting that I have, or that I don't have configured, and it's warning me just about some current changes with Microsoft. And this has been coming for a while, but this is the introduction of the Graph to API, which is a paid service. So if I want to back up Teams messages or Teams chats, there is a KB article that it mentions. So when you first set this product up, if you don't select Teams chats, you'll get this pop up, and I'll explain more as we dive through some other stuff. But for now, I'm going to say okay. And we're going to kind of dive through here just some of the overall functions. So you saw that I logged in with MFA. I'll show you real quick. So if I come into the main menu and I go to manage users, under users and roles, I can see that I have a couple users. One's a domain account and the other is a local account. And on this, on this account, I've specified enable multi-factor authentication. So I already went through the configuration of this. So currently I'm logged in as this local administrator. But you saw how that played out in action. So when the first time you go to log in, it'll do the QR code and you'll set up your multi-factor authentication step, and then from that point on, you'll have to use that rotating password. So we have that. The next thing I'll mention is, well, actually, we'll dive into kind of the infrastructure since we've kind of spent a lot of time there. So the main components, kind of going back to that early slide, is really, if you break this down simply, I have this management server that's running this, and then I have my proxies and repositories, and that's really the three main components. So I can add in additional proxies by default. This is that like all-in-one approach. When I install the product, I get this default backup proxy. This is deployed on the Windows server where the application is installed. And so out of the box, you'll have that all-in-one deployment set up. So as you add your tenant, you can start creating jobs and running with that approach. I have right now multiple proxies set up, and I'll show you here I have a proxy pool set up as well. So I have the default Windows proxy, but I also have 3 additional Linux proxies that have been added to the system. And you can see here in this proxy pane where it was saying that it checks, and I don't have any running jobs right now, so you can see that the load is very minimal. I'm not really hitting the CPU at all, and memory is very, very minimal. It's basically just OS. But we mentioned that every 10 minutes, basically, we'll re-pull that data. So if we have long running jobs, we can see if there's spikes on the resources here. And to show you too, I have one proxy here that's set to maintenance mode. So maybe for some reason this is down, or it's currently being processed through some updates or upgrade. This proxy is down. I'll show you here that kind of the extension of that is these 3 Linux proxies I've added to a proxy pool. So I can see that in this proxy pool, I have the 2 machines that are up to date and running, and then I have that one in maintenance mode. The awesome thing about that is that this will not affect jobs at all. So if I kick off a job right now that's tied to using this proxy pool for sourcing the data, then it'll just process across it'll load balance across the 2 available proxies. If I took another one and put it in the maintenance mode, the jobs will continue to process. As long as there's one proxy available in the pool, the jobs will continue to process. They will also load balance on distribution. So if I say ran a long running job and I started with these 2 proxies, but then at some point I take this 3rd proxy out of maintenance mode, it'll rejoin the running proxies. I can synchronize the data and it'll load balance across that proxy as well. So it gives us some capabilities there where we can kind of load balance and automate like live during a running job. So the next piece, so that's discussing the proxy deployment and all that. And actually I can show you too, if we edit one of these proxies. It gives us some connection string that we can connect, so we can use whatever local account we need to connect to it. I will say if we deploy a new one, we can select Windows or Linux, and I'll just select the local box that I have for demonstration. But this is that part where I can specify, I can use my current credential or whatever other credential I want here. Um, and this is where we can specify that custom account that we discussed. So I can use local system to run the proxy service, or I can specify a custom service, or I can create a new account, a new custom account. So either a pre-existing or a new account there. I'm not going to continue through that, but just to demo that capability. The last piece, so we have management, we have proxies to source the data. Now we got to place it somewhere, right? So we need a target. In this case, I just have one repository set up. It's object storage, so that I can show you the whole kind of lay of the features with proxy pools and all that stuff. This object storage is S3 compatible. It's running on a separate service, but just to show you kind of how it's configured. In previous versions of the product, we had direct ties to the proxies and repositories, so where that cache data sat on the proxy. So I'll just show you how this is kind of decoupled at this point. So I've connected to an account, so we see that we have a bucket and a folder that we can choose to dump this data to. It gives us the ability to kind of set some limits on consumption if we're, say it's a prepaid consumption, or we want to fall within some specific billing guidelines, or just safeguard ourselves from odd spikes or overuse. We can set that up. So here, and this is non-editable because I'm viewing an already created repository, but when you create a repository, I can tie this to a single proxy, or I can tie it to a proxy pool. And in this case, it's tied to my Linux proxies. And then here we talked about specification of your retention. We have two retention options here. The main one, and the one we highly recommend, is snapshot based. It's if you're used to traditional backup methodology, this is pretty much how it works. It's at the time of backup, we're saying we want to. So in this case, I'm only keeping data for 5 days. So if I run a backup today, I'm saying that snapshot that I took, that point in time, I want to hold that for 5 days. Item level retention, you can specify when you create the repository. That's a little different. We're actually going off of the creation or modification date of object versions. So if you get a new email comes in, we back up that email and it was created on whatever specific date. And we say we want to hold that for 5 days or a year or 7 years or whatever the retention is. It's going to hold that based on the existence of the object, so based on its creation, instead of based on the point of time that we actually took the backup. So a couple of little different options there. And then we can specify scheduling. So in this case, I'm going to apply retention at 11 p.m. every day. So it's going to look through and look for those objects that exceed the retention that I've specified. And this is when we're going to kind of do the purge for any data that's outside of that retention. And so you can specify this, and it gives you monthly and daily options. So I'll go ahead and cancel out of that. There is local disk. Again, this is just the default repository. So if I was going with the all-in-one option and I was not going to use object storage, I could potentially just have this as local disk storage on the backup server itself, which is how this default repository is set up. All right, so on from that, so we've kind of looked at how we deploy the backup infrastructure here. The next thing is how do we kind of move past that? So whether it's all in one or distributed deployment. We've set up our proxies. We've got repositories. The next thing we're going to need to do is add an organization. As you can see, I've added my organization, which is actually just like a developer account for Microsoft 365. So it's got some kind of pre-built data in it. You would come through and add your organization here. So I could right click on organizations and go add and walk through those steps. I'll just demo this, kind of showing as we edit the existing organization. We mentioned that pop-up when we first logged in about Teams chats, and this is where that option resides. So if I wanted to use those protected APIs, which it does warn you kind of again that there are billing charges from Microsoft for that, I can enable that if I want to back up Teams chats. By default, if I don't, I can just go with the regular options here. So I'll still back up Teams. I just won't get all the chat data. This can be deployed this is the basic Azure regions. So there's China, Germany, and government options. Default will cover most cases. I used modern authentication, which is highly recommended because it actually has a note here that basic authentication is on path to deprecation. So I'm using an existing Azure AD application. You can deploy a new one. So this will deploy the application directly into your Azure AD tenant. So here's like I have the application and stuff specified. So when you walk through the add new, like you'll walk through all those steps. So it'll actually pop up and you'll authenticate to your Azure AD with the appropriate permissions, an account that has the permissions, and it'll set up that application, which will be used for ongoing data protection. So once that's set up, kind of to follow that job best practice that Jason walked through, is in simplest terms, I only have one repository, so everything's going to the same thing. This is a very small amount of data in my lab. So in all reality, this could have been an all-in-one deployment. But just to separate so that I have better concept of failure domains, I went ahead and split out the separate services. And you can kind of see why. So I'm running into a warning here on my OneDrive. I can specifically track that down. Maybe I have somebody specifically managing OneDrive. Instead of burying all the warnings or errors within one large job, it's just nice from a management perspective to separate that out. So I can see how Teams is backing up, how SharePoint's backing up. And, if I hit this message in OneDrive, that I've got a warning somewhere along the way, I can pass that on to the appropriate administrators to see if we can track down the cause. It is highly recommended, and I think this was brought up on that slide about job creation, that at a minimum, SharePoint and Teams, we do recommend to go to the same repository. Some of that is mitigated with the Postgres database. So as we're caching data, it's pretty cool how we're doing it. Just to explain a little bit, is that we're pulling down objects from Microsoft 365. And as we pull them down, we're going to ID them. So we're going to say, okay, I have this email backed up. This object is covered, or this mailbox is covered. So that if potentially I had another job that had shared data, which is highly the case with SharePoint and Teams, I could run this Teams backup, and it could source data from SharePoint and say that object already exists. So that's kind of the cool part about how our backend metadata works, so that we're not going to potentially duplicate those objects. So I'm not going to download them twice and to store them twice and pay the fee for the double storage. It was kind of mentioned too that the on restore, and that's the next part that I'll kind of walk through here, is that when we take a restore, depending on where this data is, we potentially don't want to go and query an entire bucket, especially if we have a large amount of data out on the public cloud. So it actually mentions here that, there may be charges because we've got to query this data. The cool thing about how the product works and why we have that need for that 1% cache of our data is that we store, like I said, all those objects in that cached database. So if I'm going to do a restore and I only need to grab, potentially one email from an inbox, so I need to restore this email, I don't have to go and query our object storage, the entire bucket, to pull that data down. I'm actually accessing that in cache, and when I go to restore, now I have a very pinpointed restore query. So we minimize the APIs used there. So this is the Explorer for Exchange. We have Explorers for the other products specifically, but just to kind of highlight some of the cool features here is that we have advanced search. So if you have very specific requirements to source data, maybe it's like you have a request for information or something that you need to specifically match some query fields, we can do that. So you can search for certain terms across the organization or within certain mailboxes, and it gives you that ability. We can also, and I'm not going to log in here, but if we can connect this to production and do potential, we can compare item properties. We can compare items with production as an option. So if something is deleted, we can see that, okay, maybe it exists in the backup, but it's currently doesn't exist in production. So we can use that to kind of source our restores. The other thing is that we have some different options. So I'll just look at a single email here. I can restore this directly back to the user. So it'll put it right in the place that it used to exist. So let's say this user accidentally deleted an email. It's not an archive, and they realize it too late. It's already gone from the recycle bin, and they need this back. So we can come to our backup, and we can say that we need to restore it. I can just dump it right back to where it was. I can also export it to a PST file, which, quick thing is I could just dump it to the backup server. I could say I want to grab this file myself, and then I can, as the backup admin, I can send it where I need to. I can also save it as a message file, or I can send it as a new email back to the user, or I can send it to someone else. So there's a lot of flexibility here. The different products all have different flexible restore options in their individual explorers, but that kind of gives you an idea of how we get to this backup data and what we can do with it.
Yeah, and I just want to interrupt for a second. If you
Yeah,
guys, we covered a lot of content, with the demo, obviously with the slides as well. So if you guys have any of those questions, make sure that you go ahead and ask those questions, and we'll go ahead and get to those at the end.
yeah, and real quick, I'm going to just show one last thing. I flipped over to another lab because I don't have the restore portal set up in my personal lab. But this is just an example of, Jason did talk about that restore portal early on. It gives us the ability to do kind of self-restores or set up restore operators. So in this case, I'm logged in, and you can see at the top as a restore operator, which means I could be given different permissions to restore on behalf of the organization. So in this case, and we'll see it move forward, but I can grab a restore point. And I can walk through, I guess, too here. I'll go back to my lab real quick. Sorry. The way you get to that, if you want to set that up, is we can enable the REST API and restore options. I'm not going to walk through all the setup of this. We can point you to some articles that show you the way to configure that. But that's kind of where that's specified. But once you get that set up, just as an example, so Jon Snow apparently only has rights. His permissions are set up for himself because we're not seeing any other users populate. So this gives him the ability to come in and potentially just restore his own items. He could say, I'm missing, I'm trying to find an item. He's missing this Microsoft Viva item. It was in his email digest. He can go in and select to restore this. And he can select where he wants it to drop it back to original or new. So this just is a potential way of kind of offloading the restore operations off of your backup admins. Maybe if you have a really large organization, or you have a pretty self-efficient help desk set up, You can give very granular permissions to where they can restore either their own data, for every user, or you can have those help desk admins who can restore data on behalf of users. We can give you more information on that as a follow-up, but definitely if you have any questions, we can also dive in. And that's kind of it for the demo, Jason. I'll give it back to you for the slides, and we'll kind of move on from that piece.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tyson.
All right, so just to kind of highlight, I mentioned this briefly earlier. We kind of looked at that mid-tier deployment where I've just kind of offloaded the proxy workloads to like a proxy pool to where I can scale that out. This is, I'm not going to talk through every piece on here because obviously there's a lot of infrastructure build here, but for large enterprise deployments, we can go multiple steps further to where we potentially offload those cache and config Postgres databases to a separate server or even clustered so that we have that as a separate highly available service. And again, with NATs as well, so we can have multiple nodes and cluster that way. There are some performance concerns with clustering NATs, but we don't need to dive too far into that. But it gives us that high available function that if we lost the NATs controller, potentially we have multiple nodes. If by default NATs is deployed on the management server, so that could be the one piece that maybe for a very large deployment you want to move off, because if the backup server went down, we would lose that queue. But this, just as an example, gives you kind of like that really fully distributed model.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we kind of wrap up and get to some takeaways here, really just want to point out some great resources that we have here at Veeam. The first one's going to be Veeam University. This is free, on-demand e-learning and training that we provided. We've got pathways and modules for Veeam Backup for 365, but also, Veeam Data Platform, which is encompassing Veeam Backup for replication, the native cloud protection products for Azure, AWS, and Google. And then if you have the full platform, we also have pathways for Veeam Recovery Orchestrator, as well as Cast, and if that's something that you're looking at there as well. Now, the knowledge base is one great thing we want to point out here. We've pointed out a KB here for EWS throttling. Now, so there's going to be some really great knowledge base articles here that you may want to look at. This is a great, get in here, search around, and might find some great content. But the EWS throttling is one thing I want to bring up here. As you're starting those initial full mail backups, those first jobs, you're going to want to maybe take a look at EWS throttling. You can go ahead and remove throttling for 30, 60, 90 days on your tenant, and that KB actually shows you how to do that. The sizing calculator we went ahead and mentioned earlier, but again, this is going to be the link to get you directly to that 365 calculator. And then again, if you guys have any additional questions that come to you after the webinar, feel free to email our team directly at veeam.customersuccess.onboarding@veeam.com. Now, I did mention earlier, as I was kind of going over the Veeam 365 components, that we do have a backup as a service here at Veeam. It's called Veeam Data Cloud. And one thing to note that it is basically taking everything you saw today. It's all encompassing, and it makes it up as a backup as a service for you. And it also is now we had partnered with Microsoft and powered by Microsoft 365 backup storage. So as I mentioned, everything's included. The software, the backup infrastructure, unlimited storage that you need for your backups. So really combining all of those core components, those operations, the updates, the automations, the patching, network security, all of those requirements that you are obviously going to have to do with your environment as you install it. That's something that we take care of for you. What's going to be controlled from your end is going to go ahead and be those backup jobs. What are you protecting? What, as you're creating those backup jobs, for protecting that data, the retention of that data, restoration of that data, and then obviously, maybe some searching and discovery that you're looking for within that data as well. As we mentioned, we're now collaborated and powered by Microsoft 365 Backup Storage. And what this is essentially is we're partnering with them to utilize their specified Microsoft's 365 storage. And so we've got some different essentially some tiers, right? So the Express is going to be where you're going to be using that 365 tenant. You're going to be using the data is actually going to be stored within that Microsoft security boundary. If you're looking for more of that, the flex methodology, the flex methodology is really going to be data stored in your location of your choosing, and you're going to have a little bit more, advanced capabilities there as far as the searching capabilities, the data protection security. We're going to support Teams in that flex function as well. And then if you would, premium is basically considered the entire package there. So we're really wanted to get your guys' feedback. So, sharing your success stories. So we're really hoping after this training, as you go through your deployment of Veeam Backup for 365, if it's smooth and successful, and basically allowing full, leveraging all of the capabilities of the product. And if you're, interested in sharing that success story with Veeam, we'd love to hear from you. Our customer advocacy team is, eager to engage with you on those stories as well. So please let us know if you're interested in answering the survey questions. And the survey will start immediately after this webinar.